Leader, you mentioned in your opening the severity and severe, and you mentioned the 1930s. Are you ready to start using the D word?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I've seen that word used a lot lately at the national level, but I'm not an economist. We were clearly in a pretty deep recession. Clearly. And presumably we know more about presumably the federal government knows more how to manage the economy than they did in the 1930s. So I would hope that similar mistakes are not made so that we slip to that depth. But today, sitting here today, we know we are in a deeper, longer and deeper recession than 81, 82 in our lifetime, unless somebody was here in 1930.
Mr. Leader, does this include any stimulus money at all? I mean, have you put the FMAP money in that was built into the forecast?
No, that's why we're using the 6.4 number. You use the 4.8 number if you're just saying, all right, we're putting all that in. So those numbers aren't different. We're just saying at this moment in time, we're not exactly sure how those maintenance of efforts and everything work. That's why you will see the K-12 number in 10 and 11 will move a little because we will use some money there. Let me turn it over to Senator Cohen. We don't know the details of that, but when we know, we're going to share it. Because we're not eager to come forward and say we're going to make these level of cuts to things that we hold dearly. So if we can use federal money to transition some of it, we absolutely will. But the point, I just want to reiterate the point, if you're going to get 4-year balance, you have to cut the base at these kinds of levels, even with the revenue we're talking about. So Senator Cohen can do more on that.
But do you intend to use all the stimulus money that you can?
Absolutely. No.
Well, keep in mind with the stimulus money, there are 3 pots of money. Or 4 pots. There's the FMAP money that Larry's talked about. There's the K-12 money. There's the higher education pot of money. There's an unspecified pot of money. We've tried to structure some of that into these targets, not all of it. As Larry indicated, it's difficult to ascertain exactly what fits where. We've got some very small amounts that can be utilized, for instance, through corrections and public safety and some of the grants within that division. We're trying to sort that out. Our fiscal analysts have been working very hard since passage of the legislation. We don't have all the answers on that. So certainly, as Larry indicated, if you looked at these targets,
10 and 11 targets.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the 10 and 11 targets, particularly with K-12, I would expect that would change as we're able to determine the exact amount of stimulus money.
I'd like to follow up on something that the majority leader said a little earlier in reference to that chart.
Yes.
And I understand that your interpretation of the bill that you passed and the governor signed is that. The governor may have a different interpretation of that. If you didn't have to balance for 4 years, 2 questions. First of all, what kind of new revenue would you need? Again, not balancing 4 years. What kind of new revenue would you need, and what kind of across-the-board cuts would you need would be on these sheets?
Well, why wouldn't we balance the budget?
Well,
So we don't
Have you run
believe
that
that's
scenario?
we don't think that's a wise option for the future Minnesota not to balance the budget.
have you run that option at all, though?
We are focused on what we believe is our responsibility, which is to balance the budget. Unlike the federal government, they can deficit spend, we cannot. And so we're focused on what we understand our job to be, which is to balance the budget. And so we do not believe it's an option to not do our job and not balance the budget. And we believe that would be a mistake for the future of the state.
Senator Bach, could you
The law, we think, is pretty clear, but I didn't want to hang my hat on the law. It's just as common sense to balance your budget. It's not common sense or the law to say, well, we're going to kind of mask this all up and kind of patch things together. We've been doing that way too much in the last few years around here. And that's why we left last year with $1 billion deficit when we left here last year. Now the economy's hammered us, and that billion has grown into $6.4 billion. We cannot stay on that path. It's time, it's a day of reckoning for Minnesotans, for elected officials, both in the executive branch and the legislative branch. We need to do our duty to balance the state budget for the long-term financial health of the state.
Senator Bach, could you provide some
Tom,
greater...
just want to add on.
Just a quick clarification, you know, the 2.5 billion is the number the governor used in his budget.
Yeah, his own budget.
So I just want, there seems to be a little bit of ambiguity that's
Yeah,
his
there's no
number.
ambiguity.
Yeah, that's the pre-passage law.
Well, as long as we have a chart, let me just, kind of my take on this, on the balancing in the next biennium. I would argue that the next governor that comes here and the next legislatures that are in this building 2 years from today, I think it is irresponsible that the first piece of work they have to take on is management of a $2.5 to $3 billion deficit. I would argue that is just managing from one fiscal crisis to the next. Nobody runs a business that way. I don't believe people, at least intentionally, run their homes that way. And I don't believe government should run that way, just managing from one crisis to the next. You cannot make good decisions when you're in a constant status of crisis management.
Senator Bach, could you provide some greater specificity on what the tax aids and credits cuts are? And then number two, are tobacco taxes on the table as well?
Well, I mean, tobacco taxes poll pretty well. You know, I mean, 75% of people don't smoke. Well, surprisingly enough, they poll about 75% popular. I generally don't like them. It's a very regressive tax. My preference would be that they not be in the tax bill.
And then on the tax aids and credits cuts, do you know what, could you specify what
Well,
those are?
I've met, like everybody here, we've met with a lot of groups over the last 2 months. And I've met with school superintendents that have said, we understand we're going to have to share in this. And I've met with local governments, both at the city and county level, and they've said, you know, we're willing to share in the cuts. We just think we ought to be treated equally with everybody else. And I do think resolving the challenge that the state faces is going to be much better in our communities if everybody in the community shares in it. If everybody shares in it, this is going to be much easier for us to manage back in our communities. And I do think that's the approach I'm hearing from people that I've talked to. I've heard it from public employees, that they understand that they're going to have to make some sacrifices in the short term also if we're going to get the state's budget in balance.
What are the
Senator
state aid cut numbers?
Well, I don't have them yet. Here's what I would, at first blush, argue. That I think it might be reasonable for local governments to forego the increases they're entitled to in law. So to put essentially a freeze on the aids and credits that go to local governments. You know, currently in law, a year ago, I negotiated with the governor. Remember, the governor wanted levy limits, and we were able to negotiate some inflationary aid to counties and cities. And I would argue that, and be asking local governments to put those on hold, much like, you know, people talked about putting the wages of public employees on hold. They're entitled to increases under current law. So at a minimum, at least my first shot at it would be to freeze their aid payments where they're at today. Now, they're going to do that as a cut because they are entitled to increases under current law.
Senator Bach, you're looking at a top-tier income tax, or it's one of the ideas. Is that, should we leave here with the impression that you could raise $2 billion with that?
I think we'll probably be a little short of that. And I mean, I've got to spend time with the members of the tax committee and see where the rest might come from. But it'll be the lion's share.
Can you say roughly how much you?
No.
I think